Hello. All right. So, we're going to be continuing our series on Abolition for the People. Before we get into it, I want to do a little bit of diving into the author of this piece, Mumia Abu-Jamal. He was a former Black Panther. Is a former Black Panther, sorry. He was convicted in the 1980s for shooting a cop and was sentenced to death. As it turned out later, through lots of appeals and legal fighting, a bunch of irregularities in the testimony against him were found, as well as in the trial process itself, with the judge pledging off the record to help make sure this swings. So yeah, not exactly an impartial judge on that count. He is he's someone who, you know, in the course of being in jail, was regularly punished with solitary confinement. As we've discussed, you know, that's straight up torture. NPR was going to deliver some comments from him, from interviews with him. These were shut down because the Fraternal Order of Police sued NPR, as well as our good friend Bob Dole. Just making sure that a man completely locked behind bars for the rest of his life and condemned to die could not be heard by anybody. Just have to make sure of that. Yeah. It is fortunate that the death sentence itself was overturned, but he does remain in prison as a political prisoner, and earlier in the year, tested positive for COVID. Apparently he managed to survive it because he's still alive, so that's good. But yeah, there's a lot that can be said about him. He's written books, etc. But I just wanted to give a little bit of background on who we are going to be reading him from. Also, as an introduction, for anyone who is new here, these are intended as discussion segments. If you have questions, if you want to interject, if you have thoughts, please feel free. I will be reading. If you want to read along, here's the link that we'll be reading from. I'll be interjecting my own thoughts as we're going along, but yeah. Casting off the shadows of slavery. From one struggle to another, lessons from the first abolition movement. When people came together in the 19th century to oppose the expanding slave system, they were considered an aberration. But the course they charted continues to this day. Editor's note: in 1981, Black Panther Party member Mumia Abu-Jamal was sentenced to death by a hanging judge for the killing of a white police officer in Philadelphia. In 2000, Amnesty International found that the case was irredeemably tainted by politics and race and failed to meet international fair trial standards. Mumia forms part of the generation of black radicals on whom the state tested law and order propaganda and lockdown in the 60s, a prelude to the carceral repression it would deploy against poor black and brown urban communities in the 1980s and 1990s. On death row, Mumia became a writer of great literary power, and we are pleased to present this piece as part of Abolition for the People. Welcome, Base Left. When one thinks of the term abolition, there is a tendency to see it as a threat emerging from the left. Another perspective understands, however, that abolition is a natural response to a situation that has become untenable. What condition lay before the nation in its founding days? Slavery, human bondage, which sat like an incubus upon the new nation's foundation and transformed its stated aims and ideals into lies. After some reflection, perhaps we will see that the notion of abolition has deep historical roots. Consider summer 1776, when delegates from the Continental Congress gathered in a sweltering room in Philadelphia. These men, some of the country's intellectual elite, were scientists, writers, doctors, and thinkers. Yet their claims of a new nation's ideals were thick with contradiction. They wrote and adopted a document that said, among other things, the following: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it." These words emerge from the Declaration of Independence, adopted July 4, 1776, and celebrated throughout the U.S. annually on Independence Day today. When people came together in the 19th century to oppose the expanding slave system, they were called abolitionists. Among both the rulers and the press, such people were regarded as oddballs at best and nuts at worst. Despite present popular opinion, slavery was the air that people breathed. The nation was so deeply and openly negrophobic and racist that the idea of a multiracial group opposed to slavery was considered aberrant. I want to pause there, actually, because this is very, very poignant. I don't spend a lot of time analyzing like the discussions and debates of other creators, but there was a very high-profile debate just last night between Vosh and Charlie Kirk, and Tim Pool was there and whatever. And one of the talking points that Charlie Kirk had the gall to push was that America was not a slave nation because not all states had, as pervasive a slave system as southern states did. There's a lot of flaws to that argument, not the least of which that the initial founding of the nation in 1776 didn't include southern states. It was the initial 13. But the fact of the matter is that we also had the 3/5 compromise enshrined in the Constitution, that only white men had the right to participate in in having a political voice, and that there was no actual rejection of slavery from the federal government. It was central to the emerging economy of this fledgling nation. So it is really jarring that this is kind of an emerging, I guess it's not really emerging, it's something that those on the right have revised history in their own minds to maintain American exceptionalism or lay blameless the founding fathers, something. I'm not really sure the motivation. It's very strange. You either were never properly taught the actual intent of the Three-Fifths Compromise, or it was taught too poorly to get through to someone your age. So it's like, it's hard to say the exact intent of everyone involved, but it had to do with slave-owning states wanted to boost their population numbers so that they would have more seats in the House of Representatives, but they didn't want to call slaves whole people. Yeah. The idea of hegemony, yeah, it's a gross concept on its face. Like, because at that point, like, you are literally sitting there and analyzing, well, how much is someone of this skin color actually worth? Not to mention how, you know, natives weren't even considered 3/5 of a person. They weren't considered part of the population at all. But if you start, I'll see also the Electoral College, yeah. But if you start the foundation of your nation with all men are created equal, and then you say, yeah, except these are worth 3/5 because they have dark skin. Yeah, it's a straight up lie. And anyone who tries to argue that the nation was not built on slavery just is at odds with historical reality. I understand that conservatives lie all the time, but it is jarring how blatantly obvious some of the lies are. Like, you really just have to utterly reject history. Some men are more equal. Yeah. Right, that line is the evidence of the lie. To the founders, black men weren't men. They were property. They were just fundamentally property. They were farm equipment. To be completely... That's really what the attitude was. Yeah, they thought it was perfectly clear and honest to call it all men. You're right. In the minds of those writing the document, that is, at its core, they considered their own comrades to be that group. They never intended it to extend beyond that. Even if you set aside the founders, even if you set aside the founding document, it wasn't until, 1969, that they even had the right to have a political voice in this country. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act. And if you are living in a nation that is ostensibly a democracy, And you have no power at all to run for office or even vote for the laws that govern you or the people that govern you, then you're not part of the democracy. You are just, well, is that itself a soft form of slavery? If you have no say in how you're actually governed, the rules that dictate your life, if you have zero say whatsoever, what is that? Obviously, women also had to fight for their right to vote, but this is specifically, about the black right to vote and the anti-blackness inherent in the founding of the country. But yeah, that's a question I would put out there. And that's even today with vote suppression and the denial of those who have been incarcerated from being able to participate in the political system. You can argue semantics that it's not slavery, but I don't know. If you have absolutely no say, if you are completely and utterly beholden to other people to dictate the rules of your life, I don't see how you can't call that a form of slavery. Something to think about. Anyway, continuing on. Furthermore, the document, signed by such luminaries as Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Dr. Benjamin Rush, and John Adams, included platitudes like "all men are created equal," while dark men, propertyless white men, and all women were neither able to vote nor be voted for posts of political power. Indigenous people were seen as part of a distant wilderness and not part of the nation that was being contemplated. In October 1859, note the gap there, 1776, 1859, that's near 80 years. In October 1859, white abolitionist leader John Brown, joined by 21 men, raided the U.S. Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in an attempt to arm African captives in neighboring plantations so they could strike out for freedom. Such an attempt had to face fierce logistical challenges, given the communications needed to gain the ear and trust of a largely illiterate and deeply repressed enslaved community, constantly subjected to white armed militia surveillance. Abraham Lincoln, one of the most admired presidents in history, would describe the raid and the raiders as little better than lunatics and regicides, less than a year after the attack failed. In February 1860, Lincoln spoke before a crowd at New York's Cooper Institute, now known as Cooper Union, to distance himself and his party, Republicans, from the Harper's Ferry raid. Lincoln told his audience that Brown wasn't a Republican, and that Republicans had nothing to do with the raid. Indeed, Lincoln assured his Northern audience that neither he nor his party supported abolition. And truth be told, this is far from a remarkable perspective, for the fact of chattel slavery was one deeply normalized in American experience and history. Indeed, abolition was the exception, not the rule. This also is a chapter of Lincoln that people just don't like to talk about. It's something that our friend Mark Charles has written about pretty extensively. We like to cling to myths and mythology, fantasy. We like to sweep all the ugly under the rug, cling only to the events in American history that paint us in the best of light. Acknowledging these sorts of things is not a call to just hate the country. It's a call to recognize its flaws, recognize its continued flaws, and fight for and demand a more perfect union. If you have pancreatic cancer, and you constantly insist that you're in the perfect health, you're going to die out of cancer. Sometimes you have to acknowledge that there's a sickness in order to treat it. That also is, I bring that up because that also is a lot of rhetoric on the right, especially insofar as attacking things like critical race theory, 1619 Project, discussing slavery at all, and the continued challenges that the black population faces in this country, as just wanting to hate on the country or indoctrinate people to hate the country, and it has nothing to do with that. It's a claim that just is intended to just reject the discussion and shut it down, rather than actually think about anything. It's very frustrating, that type of rhetoric. It's deeply frustrating, because it avoids actual analysis of history. And for people who talk as if they are obsessed with preserving history, it really continues to be this jarring hypocrisy where they want to reject it. They do not want history. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to learn it. What they actually want to protect is mythology. And I get it. Mythology makes you feel great if you're white. But it's intellectually dishonest. What this means, of course, is that abolitionists were truly remarkable people who saw beyond the present into a time not yet born. Spurred often by religious convictions, abolitionists supported attacks against the slave system, which they saw as an unnecessary evil. In 1858, a year before the Harper's Ferry raid, Lincoln opined that slavery would last for at least 100 more years, or at least until 1958 or the 1960s. It is important to note that Lincoln's prognostication was meant to appease the slaveocracy. It was not an assessment of the counter-revolutionary dynamic that would detonate after the war. See, Castro says, cognitive dissonance is the first trait of the conservative. Yeah, it is. It is. I have yet to figure out how to actually speak to the conservative mind. Because of that fact. Like, I don't mind having challenging conversations and having ideas challenged. But when someone is just wanting to just toss out actual historical fact and historical record just because they find it inconvenient, and then turn around and accuse of intentions that don't exist to try and pollute the conversation, it's a pointless waste of time. So I try to, I hope to reach people that at least are willing to learn. Despite this observation, what that means to us writing from the 21st century is that people we now regard as successful African American leaders and entrepreneurs like Oprah Winfrey, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Thurgood Marshall, Reverend Jesse Jackson, Duke Ellington, Lena Horne, Muhammad Ali, Dr. Maya Angelou, Debbie Allen, Toni Morrison, Malcolm X, Bessie Smith, Maxine Waters, Alex Haley, Lerone Bennett, Hank Aaron, and yes, even Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas would have been born into captivity if Lincoln's opinion prevailed. Unfortunately, to many people, politics is sports. Talking points are slogans to them, not ideas. That's true. It's something that I hope to be able to fight back against in at least some small way. Because it's not sports. It's very much real life. With stakes higher than winning political points or dunking on your opponent. Abolitionists brought forth another vision, and hence another future. Harper's Ferry, Virginia was a step in the fateful march to a war that, after earth-shaking sacrifice, led to the abolition of slavery. Thus, abolition was not a skip in the park. It is a deep, committed movement of social transformation that seeks to bring down institutions that needlessly inflict pain upon the people. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and John Brown forged a new America, one unimaginable to earlier generations. They saw farther than their contemporaries and even warned them of problems threatening from the periphery. In May 1865, a month after the Confederacy surrendered to Union forces, Douglass delivered a potent warning for his fellow abolitionists about the counter-revolutionary threats that emerged from the ruins of the Civil War. Slavery has been fruitful in giving itself names. It has been called the peculiar institution, the social system, and the impediment. It has been called by a great many names, and it will call itself by yet another name. You and I and all of us had better wait and see what new form this old monster will assume, in what new skin this old snake will come forth next. Chilling words, proving very true. Douglass's warning about the mutability of that old racist snake was not heeded. The achievements of Reconstruction were drowned in a sea of terror and blood. The lessons of the noble anti-slavery abolition movement is before us. It is a lesson to struggle and struggle from generation to generation until the people are finally free and that old snake has no more masks behind which to hide. Abolitionists tried to make the nation live up to its promises of equal justice, of freedom, and the rights enshrined in the Reconstruction Amendments set forth in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which were designed to protect the rights of black citizens. The Reconstruction era marked a brief period of black post-war freedom until the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the 1875 Civil Rights Act. In that area, white supremacists waged a terror war against black people and maintained it for the better part of a century, until the emergence and rise of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The lessons of the noble anti-slavery abolition movement are before us. Lessons to struggle and struggle from generation to generation until the people are finally free. And that old snake has no more mask behind which to hide. The 13th Amendment ensured the continuation of slavery by another name, in the guise of the carceral state. Today, prisons are the third largest employer in the nation, according to sociologist Loic Wacquant, and black people are once again its currency. Although we have drawn from the text of the Declaration of Independence to cite the right of the people to abolish unjust systems that threaten the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the people, that right doesn't arise from the document. It comes from the hearts, minds, and urgings of the people, the living people who today breathe the air that sustains us all. Is that not the same energy that calls us to support today's abolition movement, that works to tear down the system that deprives millions of people, entombed in prison cells in solitary confinement, and in this prison house of nations, of their life, liberty, and the pursuit of their happiness? We need not historicize questions nor cast them into the hoary days of the past. They live with us in our hopes, our dreams, our visions of a world free of such repressive systems that are but shadows of slavery. Abolition now. Editor's note: after coming close to execution twice in the 1990s, Mumia's life was saved when a mass international movement mobilized in the streets on his behalf. In 2011, after 28 years on death row, a federal court ruled that Mumia's death sentence had been obtained unconstitutionally. His sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole. Make no mistake, this is not enough. Freeing political prisoners is the moral assignment of every emerging generation of revolutionaries and freedom fighters. It's time to bring Mumia and all political prisoners home. So, those were the words of Mumia Abu-Jamal, casting off the shadows of slavery, recognizing that the abolitionist movement was in the origin of the nation, leading through the Civil War, and is still today the exception and not the rule. It is true that discussing these things, calling for them, is very alien to so many people who just have accepted the status quo as normal and an institution to uphold because of that normalization. It is an uphill battle to educate people on these things and to sway hearts and minds and actually spur to action the duty we have to abolish these unjust systems. But it's necessary work. Yeah. So that is the close of that essay. Let's shift gears.